So the paper, as you can see, is a joint paper with Jim Grossman, and it is on tariffs that disrupt global supply chains. And I will start with some background and motivation. So the fact is that inputs comprise a very large share of world trade. And some inputs are traded on anonymous world markets, while others are transacted within what we call global supply chains. And the World Bank published recently the World Development Report that was devoted to global supply chains. And in this report, they describe what global supply chains are and how they came about being. And so they say they were made possible by fragmentation of production. This is a topic on which Ron worked for many years. They impose surge costs to bring buyers and suppliers together, and they require a matching of compatible buyers and suppliers. And they typically generate durable relationships between the buyers and suppliers. So there is some stickiness in these relationships, although what controls them are not necessarily long-term contracts. But they also involve occasionally relationship-specific investment and incomplete contracts. And this is an important topic that I will not touch on today. So the theoretical analysis that I'll present handles everything on this list except for the last part. There is a very large literature on supply chains, but very little in this literature deals with trade policy and how it affects the reorganization of production of these global supply chains. So for example, in the pre-2018 period, there were barriers to trade that were quite low, and with a big difference between tariffs on intermediate inputs and tariffs on final goods. The average tariff on final goods, consumer goods, among the G20 countries were about 70 and 75 to 75% higher than tariffs on intermediate inputs. And in the US, the average applied tariff between 2010 and 2017 on consumption goods was more than 4 times as high as on intermediates. The tariffs on intermediates were very low before the Trump tariffs. They were actually lower than 1%. But all of this changed with the Trump tariffs. So the Trump tariffs, starting with September 2018, imposed tariffs on intermediates imported from China, and they covered 85% of these imports, but only 29% of imports of consumer goods. And under the phase 1 deal, 93% of intermediates covered by these specific tariffs. So this difference between tariffs on intermediates and final goods took a turn, and a pretty dramatic turn. So we calculated the average applied tariffs on imports of consumer goods and intermediate goods from China for this period, and you can see it in this figure. So the blue curve describes the tariffs on intermediate goods, and the red one, tariffs on final goods. And you see that until 2017, the tariffs on final goods were higher. And then there was a dramatic rise in tariffs on both types of goods, with the tariffs on intermediate rising much more. And this is the motivation for our theoretical analysis. But before I go there, I want to make a point about how the supply chain were affected. So there has been a lot of anecdotal evidence from the business press about this. And what this evidence points out is that there was a shift in sourcing of intermediate inputs from China to other countries, such as Vietnam and Thailand. And this happened in a variety of industries, from electronic to furniture and so on. And a variety of large firms were involved in this shift. So if we estimate a different diff regression using monthly data, we can uncover this shift statistically. And this is reported in the following table. What we have here is the log of imports from China and the log of imports from 13 low-cost other countries. And we regress each one of them on the difference between the tariffs on Chinese goods and tariffs on the goods imported from the other countries. And obviously, the escalation was that the tariffs on Chinese goods went up much more than tariffs on the other countries. In fact, in many of these countries, there was no change in the tariff rates. And what you see is, from the simple estimation, that imports from China declined and imports from these other low-cost countries increased. So this is the motivation. And what was the goal of this paper? It is to develop a model of trade in intermediate inputs that capture the features that I've already described from the report of the World Bank as far as relational supply chains are concerned. By the way, Ron wrote a lot about trade in intermediate inputs, and he liked to call them middle products. But this term middle products didn't catch up, and so I keep using the term intermediate inputs. So the features that we built into the model are the fragmentation of production, costly surge, variable match productivity between the buyer and seller, short-term contracts, which can be renegotiated at any instant, and there are sunk costs that generate stickiness in the relationships, and these sunk costs emanate from the need to search for suppliers. So using the model, we study sourcing patterns, price and welfare effects, and what's important is we study discriminatory, unanticipated tariffs. So the tariffs will be imposed on one particular country, but not on other countries, because this is the nature of tariffs that we face these days. So obviously, this type of policy is inconsistent with WTO requirements, but this is actually what has happened. So we are going to distinguish between what we call small tariffs, which doesn't mean that they are necessarily low. They can be as high as, say, 20 or 25%, but they have the feature that they don't induce search for supplier in another country. So think about sourcing inputs from China, and the government imposes a 20% tariff on imports of these intermediate inputs. Then under what we define as a small tariff, if an American buyer wants to find a supplier, she is going to look for this supplier in China and not somewhere else. And then what we call large tariffs are tariffs that pass a threshold which makes it profitable to search for supplier in another country. So instead of China, the buyer will search for a supplier in Vietnam or Thailand or any other country where it's appropriate. So the problem that we do not deal actually from this entire list of the World Bank is the holdup problem, which has been dealt to some extent in other papers. And in principle, it can be integrated in our framework as well. So what is the framework that we are using? So we construct a two-sector model. One sector produces a homogeneous good with labor only, and there is competition in this sector and constant returns to scale. Then there is another sector that produces non-traded varieties of a differentiated product. And in this sector, there is monopolistic competition. And the producers in this sector need intermediate inputs that they acquire through global supply chains. So we make the assumption that the final goods are not traded here in order to focus on the intermediate inputs so that there are no imports of the final goods. It sort of focuses attention on what is central in this analysis. So the technology for the differentiated products works like this. It combines labor and a composite intermediate good. And this composite consists of a continuum of traded inputs. And we assume that they come in fixed proportion. This makes everything much sharper. So inputs can be imported from one country or more, or they can be produced at home. And also we allow them to be produced in-house by the final good producer. But in equilibrium, she will be sourcing them. So I'll focus only on this case. Importantly, there is search and bargaining. A final good producer has to find a supplier of an intermediate input, and this is costly. Once she found a supplier, there is a match-specific productivity, and then she has to can decide to negotiate with the supplier a price or go back and try to find a better supplier. So this is the structure, and I'll be more specific about it in a moment. And we start the analysis with a long-run stationary equilibrium in which everybody expects free trade. And so firms enter in the home country, say the US, and they source their inputs from one foreign country, say China. And in the stationary equilibrium, there is no incentive for change. So there is a fixed number of firms. Every firm has its own supplier, and there is no incentive to change the supply chains. So starting from this equilibrium, we consider an unanticipated tariff shock. And the tariff shock will be perceived to be permanent. So the economy will move from this initial free trade equilibrium to this tariff-ridden equilibrium, and it will reach a new stationary equilibrium. So this is the idea. So now let me quickly describe some fundamental technical features. So we assume that preferences are quasi-linear with a constant elasticity and CES aggregate of the differentiated product. So Y is the homogeneous good, capital X is the aggregate of the differentiated product, and this function of capital X has a constant elasticity, which is epsilon, and the aggregate capital S has a bunch of varieties of the differentiated good with an elasticity of substitution sigma. And we assume that sigma is bigger than epsilon. So what this is going to give us, is going to give us a constant elasticity demand for the aggregate differentiated products. And within these varieties, there is an elasticity of demand, which is given by the elasticity of substitution. So all of this is, of course, very familiar. So how does the production structure work? As I said, the homogeneous good is produced with labor only. So we normalize units so that it's just equal to the labor input. This implies, of course, that the marginal productivity of labor is 1 in this industry. We choose this product to be the numeraire. So this implies that the wage rate is equal to 1 in the home country. And so we forget about the wage rate is just equal to 1. And we will look at wages in other countries. As far as the production of the differentiated varieties is concerned, as I said before, it's a output of a particular variety, lowercase x, is a function of labor input and the input of these bundles of intermediate goods. So M is the number of bundles of intermediate goods, each bundle consisting of a continuum of measure 1 of various inputs. Occasionally, we will use a Cobb-Douglas specification. And if we use a Cobb-Douglas specification, then the unit cost of producing a variety of the differentiated product, C of phi, is a function of phi, which is the cost of a unit of this intermediate. So it's going to be phi to the power alpha. Alpha comes from the Cobb-Douglas. And the wage rate is 1, and this is the reason why the wage rate doesn't appear here, because it's not equal to 1. Okay, so now we come to search, which is an important element here. So there's a bunch of countries in which a given producer of the final good can find a supplier for each one of this continuum of intermediate inputs. So we are going to assume that all the relevant features for search in these countries are the same, except for the wage rate. So we'll focus on wage variation across these countries that are potential suppliers. And if everything else that's relevant for the search is the same, then obviously you are going to search in the lowest cost country, say country A. So the wage rate in country A will be WA, which for now we can write just as W, as long as we are not concerned with a second country. This is the relevant wage for buying goods that are produced in this country, say China. So how does search proceed? So at a capital cost, capital F, the firm can take a draw of the supplier in China, in country A, for a particular input J. And what is this distribution G? You learn from it the inverse productivity of the match with a supplier, which is denoted here by lowercase a, and we normalize the support of the distribution to be between 0, 1. So if I take a draw from this distribution, it means I take a draw from the potential supplier, I find somebody with an A in this interval, then this particular supplier can produce the input I need at cost WA. This is what we see here. But the point is that I have to use an optimal search strategy. So I can, once I have a supplier, I can negotiate with him the supply and including the price, or I can go back and perform another search and which cost me again capital F. So there is this capital cost. I can do as many searches as I want. Now, as is well known in search theory, this type of problem has a relatively simple solution. In our case, the solution is even simpler by making an assumption which says that search is not time consuming. I'll make some remark about this at the end. So it means the following. I can pay F and find a supplier. If I like the guy, I negotiate a price. If I don't like the guy, I pay another F and I perform another search. But no time elapses between the two searches. So there is no time dimension, and this is very important for our simplification. So in this type of problem, the optimal search strategy consists of a cutoff rule where there is some inverse productivity A bar that you see here marked in yellow. And this means that if you find a supplier with inverse productivity below A bar, you stop searching. But as long as you search and you find only suppliers with an inverse productivity above this cutoff, you go back to search, you don't negotiate a deal with these type of suppliers. And then you can compute the expected search cost when you use this strategy. So the capital cost of search using a strategy A bar can be converted into a flow cost by multiplying the capital cost with the interest rate R. And what we show is that this flow cost is equal to the flow cost by converting the capital cost of search, capital F, to a flow, RF, divided by the probability that you find somebody whose inverse productivity is below the cutoff A bar. So once you have chosen a search strategy, it gives you the expected search cost in this problem. Now recall that there's a continuum of these inputs, and therefore what's happening if you use the same search strategy for each one of them, you'll get a distribution of inverse productivities, which is the truncated distribution of the distribution capital G, and the truncation is determined by your search strategy. Okay, so this is a sort of important new element in this model. And we are going to assume, not all the time, but for certain purposes, that this distribution of inverse productivity is Pareto with a shape parameter theta. So as you well know, the shape parameter determines the dispersion of this inverse productivity and therefore also the productivity. Okay, the other new element which is important here is the bargaining. So suppose that I am searching for a supplier of a particular input J, and I find a supplier whose inverse productivity A is below the cutoff that I have chosen as my search strategy. Then I negotiate with the supplier a price, an X factor price, which is denoted by rho of A. And the negotiation is a generalized Nash bargain with weights beta for the buyer and 1 minus beta for the supplier. So we solve this problem. The buyer comes to the supplier with a request for a certain quantity M that the buyer determines. And the point is that if you as a buyer, you have negotiated some deals with other suppliers, you need exactly the same amount from this marginal supplier, because if you get more, it doesn't help you. And if you get less, then it's useless. So this is where the Leontief structure makes life a little bit easier. So you come and you order this quantity and you bargain over a price. In the bargaining game, the outside options are like this. For the buyer, if the negotiations break down, the outside option is to go and find another supplier. If you go and try to find another supplier, what you get is the expected X factory price under your search strategy. And therefore, your outside option is the mean or the expected value of this X factory prices, and this is denoted here by mu sub rho. This tells you that this is the expected value of rho under the search strategy A bar. And then you'll have to bear again the search cost until you find somebody who's below the cut of A bar, and this cost is going to be F over G of A bar. So this gives you the outside option for the buyer, and then the outside option for the supplier is just 0. If I don't buy from you the product, then you don't lose anything, and you also don't gain anything. So what we show then is that this leads to a cost function of a bundle of intermediate inputs, which is given here. It has a fixed cost component that depends on the cost of search under the search strategy that you use. It depends also on the bargaining weight. And then there is a variable cost component where the marginal cost is given by the wage rate in China times the expected or the mean inverse productivity of your search strategy, given that you use A bar. So this is the mean inverse productivity under the truncated distribution. Okay, so this is what we show. And we get from here what we call the perceived marginal cost, which is W of mu A. And it has, this cost function has nice properties. It gives you an average cost, which is above marginal cost, as is usually the case in the monopolistic competition models. Okay, so if you want to buy a certain amount of the intermediates M, then how do you choose your search strategy? You choose it to minimize this cost function that I showed you on the previous slide, but you also have to go to the profit function and substitute in the solution and then optimize also the amount of intermediates that you are going to use. So it's a more involved optimization problem. I'm not spelling it out. I'm sure you can figure it out for yourself. This leads to this input price, the X factory price, rho of A, which has this form, which is the weighted average of the inverse productivity of the seller from whom you try to buy the good, and the cut of A bar, which is the inverse productivity of the least productive seller with whom you deal. Now, this is sort of nice, this equation, because it tells you immediately, for example, how the X factory price of a supplier with a particular inverse productivity will change if you change your search strategy. But obviously you change your search strategy only if you want to buy a different amount of the intermediates. So there's this full general equilibrium interaction that you have to sort out. Okay, so what about other things? There's simple markup pricing here, except that the relevant marginal cost is builds on the perceived marginal cost of the intermediate inputs. So C of phi gives you the marginal cost of producing a unit of the final good. And then there is free entry of final good producers in the home country. And free entry means that the operating profits, which are denoted here by pi 0, that you compute from everything that I just told you, they have to be equal to the entry cost FE, converted here into a flow, plus the actual search cost that you bear. So this should give you a good idea about the structure of the model. We solve out the full equilibrium of this model, assuming that there are no tariffs, and this is a stationary equilibrium. We actually can solve everything in closed form if we use Cobb-Douglas and Pareto. And this is the starting point of our analysis. So I gave you the basic model, and now we come to the real business. If somebody has a question or two, I think this is a good time to ask at least a clarifying question. Okay, no questions.
So I'll
okay, so Eric, did you want to ask something?
No, I'll ask something, Elhanan. Just real quickly. So there's this kind of dynamic matching component, and it seems like very important that the ability of your match doesn't change over time. Otherwise, you would get very different pricing because you have to think about the likelihood that this guy is going to be good in the future. Is that how I should interpret it?
Yeah, this is a Catholic marriage, but you can dissolve it only if there is some shock. Yeah, so, and the point is that here the following, that if I match with somebody, in this stationary environment, neither the buyer nor the supplier have an incentive to deviate.
No,
but
right.
As we will see soon,
the type of the match never changes over time. So that seems a crucial assumption in the way you set up the model. Otherwise, I would have to think about kind of the process for the shocks that are hitting the firms, right?
Right. I mean, if, for example, the supplier were subjected to some dynamic productivity shocks, then yes,
okay.
One will have to factor it in. Okay. But here, the supplier has a particular, the match, inverse productivity is constant.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes, this is the assumption, essentially.
Elhanan, you could do that. You could adapt this question when you have where the supplier productivity can change. If you choose carefully the probability distribution, you probably can just add to the interest rate. You know?
Yeah,
so that
if it's
right, if you make a match, that's all you have to know. What kind of flows you expect from that match, and that would come in a little bit like the interest rate. And then, of course,
if it comes only through
bad habits.
If it comes only through the interest rate, it's not a problem.
Yeah.
But let me keep things simple.
Yeah.
If it comes only through the interest rate, it's not a problem. But I'm going to keep things simple because you'll see in a moment that there are many other complications coming in.
I understand.
We keep this simple.
Let's keep it the same, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's natural for somebody coming from finance to think how things will be driven through the interest rate.
I was just actually making you a point, and I don't think the changes, the shocks to productivity. Shock of productivity works like an option. You know, if your guy becomes cheaper, you get the cheaper price. If he becomes more expensive, you have to search again. That's basically the idea. Or you have to consider shopping, searching again.
Right.
That is, you know, I think it's not going to bring any new element to what you're doing. That's what I want to say.
Okay, thank you.
Probably good enough. Because nothing else, you know, most of the analysis is going to come from this case.
George, how long do you want me to talk?
I think we can go another 20 minutes. Is that right? Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so think about this economic structure. We are in this stationary equilibrium, and now the government country A in the home country imposes a tariff, which we denote by tau. We denote 1 plus the tariff rate. But this tariff is discriminatory. It applies only to inputs imported from country A, say China. It does not apply to other countries. And so the question is, what will happen? Because of our assumptions, in particular the assumption that search is not time consuming, what happens is, in response to the shock, the system jumps immediately to a new stationary equilibrium. And this is the new stationary equilibrium is what I'm going to describe. So the first thing I'm going to describe, because I don't have obviously time to go through lots of detail, is the shift, how the sourcing patterns shift. So imagine that there is some other country, can I say Vietnam, with a higher wage, but this country is not subjected to the tariff. So this is the wage rate in Vietnam is WB, and the wage rate in China is WA. So WB over WA is bigger than 1, okay? This other country can be the United States, which means that you choose to find now suppliers in the US rather than searching in a foreign country. But I don't have time to talk about this case, so we analyze both cases. So the first thing to note is the following. As long as the tariff that consists of 1 plus the tariff rate, so tau, is below this wage ratio, WB over WA, we are in the small tariff case, meaning that if you break down a relationship with a supplier, you are going to look for a new supplier in China. You are not going to switch to another country. And if you are in this range, then what happens is that if the elasticity of demand for the differentiated products, epsilon, exceeds 1, then the original producers retain all suppliers from country A, and there are no new entrants. And as long as operating profits are positive, there is also no exit. So the number of firms doesn't change. Okay, and I will assume that there is no exit. However, given that there is a tariff, they will not switch suppliers, but they will renegotiate prices. And I'll talk about the price renegotiation later, because the negotiation in the shadow of the tariff is different from the negotiation without a tariff. So in the case of elastic demand, if the sector has a higher elasticity of demand, this type of sourcing pattern extends beyond the wage ratio up to a tariff that is denoted here by TC in the upper panel of the figure. And we characterize exactly the cutoff tariff in the paper. Now, a larger tariff than this cutoff generates the following. The original producers replace some suppliers from country A, from China, with suppliers in another country, say Vietnam, and still there are no new entrants, so the number of firms remain the same. So this leads to trade diversion from China to Vietnam or some other country. Okay. In the case of inelastic demand, which is the lower panel, what's happening is the following. If the tariff is small, by our definition, namely it's always, if you search for a new supplier, you search in China, the original producers retain all suppliers from country A. However, there's going to be entry of new suppliers. There will be entry of new firms in the home country. And they will also search for suppliers in country A. Why does this happen? Because with a small elasticity of demand, what the tariff does, it raises prices, and when it raises prices, this raises expenditure on the differentiated products. So profits go up. And when profits go up, there is new entry into the industry until profits come down back where they were. And if they come down where they were before, then the original entrants, they are as happy now as they were before, despite the tariff in terms of their profitability. When the tariff exceeds this value, then it pays to search for suppliers in country B. And in this case, the original producers replace some of the suppliers from country A with suppliers from country B. So there is trade diversion. And the new entrants now search for suppliers not in country A, but rather in country B. So there's still entry of new firms in the home country, but they search immediately for suppliers in Vietnam. So we show that these are the patterns of sourcing that emerge in response to the tariff, and the exact response depends on the size of the tariff. Okay, so let me jump forward. I'll skip all sorts of details. And let me give you the proposition which sort of summarizes some of the points that I made and provides a little bit more insight. So what we show is that in the elastic case, a small tariff generates no new searches, as I described before, and no entry or exit, but there is renegotiation with suppliers to higher input prices. So what does this mean? It means that what the tariff does in the elastic case, it weakens the bargaining power of the buyers. And as a result, although they don't replace the suppliers, they end up paying higher ex-factory prices. And then on top of this, they have to pay the tariff. So this leads to higher consumer prices, and the price index of the differentiated product rises. What happens in the small elasticity case? So here too, there are no new searches by the original producers, but also the original producers keep paying the same ex-factory price to their suppliers. But there is entry of new suppliers, and more of them enter the higher the tariff in this range. Consumer prices rise, and the price index rises also despite the fact that there is entry of new firms, which means that there is more variety. So the rise in variety does not compensate for the higher prices, and the price index increases. So we can now calculate welfare responses to the tariff, and welfare has here 4 components. And this is only, this equation gives you the components that may change in response to a tariff. There are some constants also, but they are not included here. So there are the incumbents aggregate variable profits. This is the pi function. If there are entrants, their net profits are 0, so they don't contribute any extra income. And then the incumbents, if they engage in new searches, this generates additional costs, and therefore we have to look at their profits net of search costs. Then there is aggregate revenue, which we assume is redistributed in a lump sum fashion back to the public, and then there is consumer surplus. So all of this basically comes from the indirect utility function. And as you know, if you have a quasi-linear utility function, then the indirect utility function consists essentially of income plus consumer surplus. And this is the, now you can take this and you can split it in different ways in order to calculate the differential in response to the tariff. So in some cases, we decompose it into the impact of labor employment in the industry and employment of intermediates, the terms of trade effect, search costs. Depending on the case you analyze, different decompositions prove to be useful, basically. So what do we show in terms for the small tariff case? in the elastic case, we show that there are welfare losses when this condition is satisfied, and I don't have time to discuss it. And in the inelastic case, there are welfare losses when the second condition is satisfied. But importantly, in both cases, welfare is always held if the bargaining power of the final good producers is high. So this says the following: if your manufacturers source in China and they are in a good bargaining position, you have no business of imposing tariffs for welfare reasons. Now, if their bargaining position is weak to begin with, then maybe. But this maybe is a big may. But if they are in a good bargaining position, then forget about it. You know you are going to screw up by imposing tariffs. Okay, so to save time, I will jump over additional considerations and go to the next proposition for large tariffs. So suppose we are in a world of large tariffs, so that the tariffs now exceed the relative wage ratio in Vietnam and say China, then if there is a surge, it's going to take place in Vietnam, not in China. But this also means that the bargaining between an American producer and a Chinese supplier will take place in the shadow of the potential surge in Vietnam. And in some cases, there will be actual switches to leave the Chinese suppliers and switch to Vietnamese suppliers. But even if you don't switch, this affects the price that you end up paying. So what is the outcome here? So in the inelastic case, the producers retain all suppliers whose productivity is low enough, or the inverse productivity is high enough. So and then you abandon the inefficient Chinese supplier and you switch to Vietnam. Okay? And what happens in the elastic case is that producers, they preserve the entire supply chain in country A as long as the tariff is below this cutoff TC that I described to you in the initial graph. So we have a characterization of it. But if the tariff exceeds this, then the producers retain their initial suppliers only if they are productive enough, and they leave the less productive suppliers and switch to Vietnam. So what are the welfare implications of all this? I gave you some results, and what I want to do now is just show you some graphs that summarize these findings. So this is the case of elastic demand. The elasticity of demand for the differentiated products exceeds 1. And in this example, as you can see, the bargaining power is half and half. So it's not extremely high, but it's also not extremely low. And the elasticity of demand exceeds 1. It's 1.5 in this example. So what happens here is that as the tariff goes up, and we stay in the small tariff case so that surge proceeds only in China, this brings about a deterioration of the terms of trade. And the movement in the terms of trade is an important component of welfare. So the terms of trade deteriorate until we hit the boundary of the small tariff case, which in this example is 20%. Now, what's important here is that as long as you stay within this range of tariffs, the outside option of the buyer is driven by surge in China. But once you cross this threshold of the tariff, then you go beyond 20%, the relevant outside option is to search in Vietnam. So what you see is there is now a range between 20% and this tau C, in which you don't abandon your suppliers, you keep your Chinese suppliers, but you have now a better outside option, which is to search in Vietnam in case the negotiations break down. And this is enough to bring down prices, and therefore we observe this improvement in the terms of trade. But of course, the point is that once you cross this threshold of tau C, then you actually go to Vietnam to find suppliers in order to replace the least efficient Chinese suppliers. So now there's a trade-off. On the one hand, you get lower prices in China. On the other hand, you have to bear this additional search cost, and the ex-factory prices are on average more expensive in Vietnam, where the wage rate is higher. So initially, you still get some improvement in the terms of trade, but eventually the terms of trade start to deteriorate because they are now a weighted average of the prices these buyers pay in Vietnam and the prices they pay in China. So eventually, we get this deterioration in the terms of trade. So this obviously has welfare consequences. So for the elastic case, what this figure shows is that there are welfare losses all the way down to the threshold that leads you to want to search in another country. Then there's a little bit of an increase in welfare. This is when you don't go to Vietnam, but you use Vietnam as an outside option to reduce prices in China. But then once you start going to Vietnam, welfare keeps declining. So this is the welfare implication in the elastic case. Now, if you go to the inelastic case, then things are a little bit different. There can be a little bit of an increase in welfare at the beginning, but then eventually it starts falling. And once it becomes profitable to search in Vietnam, welfare falls substantially. And the reason it falls is that there are two reasons now. One is there is a Wienerian type of trade diversion. So the country pays higher input prices by sourcing from Vietnam, although this is profitable from the point of view of the companies. And the other is that there are now search costs, which also contribute to a decline in welfare. However, if the elasticity of demand is quite low and the bargaining power of the American firms are weak, then in this inelastic case, what can happen is that the tariff will be beneficial. Why will the tariff be beneficial? Because the tariff is strengthening the bargaining power of the American buyers in China. And as a result, they can bring down prices there, and this can contribute to a rise in welfare. And here you have a simulation where this is happening. There's a quite low elasticity of demand, which means that what the tariff does, it shifts very fast demand towards the differentiated products, raising productivity, raising entry, and so on. And we have a weak bargaining power of the American producers, which here goes down from 0.5 to 0.3. Okay, so I hope that I convinced you that this is an interesting framework that generates rich patterns, some of which, at least the basic patterns, appear to be interesting in view of what we have seen. So in conclusion, what we have done is we have proposed a new mechanism for tariffs to affect prices and welfare. And what we emphasize with this mechanism is the price negotiation, which is conducted in the shadow of renewed search. And what tariffs do is they impact these negotiations. And the input prices, they rise or fall if incentives for search are reduced or intensified. Because I jumped over a variety of details, I didn't discuss this point, but this is exactly what's happening, that the impact of tariffs on ex-factory prices depends on whether they raise your incentive to search harder, meaning to have a lower cutoff, or to be more laxer in your search, meaning having a higher cutoff. Importantly, there is the bargaining here drives a wedge between the marginal cost of inputs as perceived by the companies and the true marginal cost to the country. And this is driven by the fact that the bargains with different suppliers are independent from each other in our formulation. So when I bargain with a particular supplier in China, I take as given my bargains with all the other suppliers that sell me these intermediate inputs. And this produces a distortion, and this distortion drives some of the welfare results, and we discuss these issues in the paper. And as I said at the end, if the tariff is very large, it produces new search in Vietnam, in our example, yes. And this new search generates Vinerian trade diversion, which is bad for welfare. And on top of this, there are additional search costs, which are bad for welfare. So to close, there are some elements, obviously, that are missing in the models. We have structured it in a way which focuses attention on this particular mechanism, and this was the purpose of our analysis. So, for example, there's no comparative advantage. If there are comparative advantage in different types of inputs, then you will not source everything from China. You might end up sourcing some inputs in China, others in Vietnam, others to begin with, even with zero tariffs. And then the tariffs will do a reallocation of this. The other things that we simplified, as I explained, was that there is no time for search. If search is time consuming, we found that the model becomes extremely complicated. As you may know from the labor literature, when there is on-the-job search, it complicates things substantially, and we thought that we have enough complications as is, and that this is not going to be an essential element. One nice thing that one will obtain with time-consuming search is that there won't be a jump from one steady state to another. There will be some transition dynamics. They may be quite interesting, but at this point, we haven't done any analysis of this. And the other thing that's sort of missing is a potential hold-up problem, which can arise if both sides have to do some investment in the relationships, and then it has to be governed by incomplete contracts. I think that one could incorporate this, but we haven't really done any effort to do it. So I hope that I convinced you that it's an interesting framework to analyze an important issue, and that the results are quite interesting and not so obvious. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elhanan. And maybe we'll try to see if people have some questions or any comments. We were all quite quiet during the talk, probably because it was so clear. I'll ask one question, Elhanan, which is just, so I'm not used to working with models with outside goods, and they're very convenient, right? They make these wages fixed. So I was just wondering how the results would differ if we kind of had a model without the outside good and had sort of an additional terms of trade effect that would be operating. Would you find the tariffs would be optimal in this environment?
Well, I don't know if tariffs are never optimal here. They can be like a second or third best, because there are quite a bit of distortions So when we go through the careful welfare analysis, we identify a number of distortions. So just the tariff is not going to bring you to first best here.
No,
but I think
the traditional terms of trade effect, which is kind of shut down with the outside good. You know,
you cannot shut down the outside good here because you have to pay with something for the intermediate inputs. So as long as the differentiated varieties are not traded, the pattern of trade here is you import intermediate inputs and you pay for them with the outside good.
Okay.
Now, if you want to shut out the outside good, then you have to allow trade in the final consumer goods, the differentiated varieties, because you need something to pay for the intermediates.
Okay. All right. Do we have some other questions? So what I'm going to try to do is give us all an opportunity to interact through a breakout room.
So George, I had one question.
Okay, Mike, go ahead, please.
So if there were capacity constraints in Vietnam, how would that affect the analysis? Because obviously Vietnam
If
can't
there were
replace all of China.
capacity, yeah, if there were capacity constrained either in China or in Vietnam, then the outside option of the suppliers wouldn't be zero. So then in the bargaining game, you'll have to factor in the capacity constraint, right? I mean, this is like, in a way, you know, it's not exactly, but it's related to, say, the Krebs-Schenkman paper on oligopoly, that you build up capacity first, then you play a price game, but the capacity constrains the price game, and in many circumstances, you end up with Cournot, despite the fact that you play a price game. But in any case, here, it's clear what's going to happen. If you have a capacity constraint or an upward sloping supply curve of every input in the foreign countries, this will change the outside option and it will not be zero. And in principle, one can rework the model. I don't know what the result will be. It will be obviously messier than what you have seen so far.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So yes, so I think I really like the paper because I mean I'm not really in the trade field, but feels like the paper is very cool and it's very micro-funded. So and then the conclusion is that the bargaining is very important because that drives a wedge between marginal cost and the true social cost. How important is that? I suppose if I have a different setup, like say I have a variable markup, would that also deliver similar results?
You mean a variable markup on the final consumer goods, or what? There is here a variable markup on the intermediate inputs.
On the intermediate
but
inputs.
there is no variable markup on the final consumer good because it's CES, so the markup factor is constant, and what's shifting around is the marginal cost of production. But there is a variable markup on the intermediate inputs because the foreign suppliers, they don't charge the marginal cost. And so the markup that they gain is essentially the X factory price divided by their marginal cost. And we have seen that the X factory price can change for a particular supplier. And this changes the markup for this particular supplier when the economy is subjected to the tariff.
Thank you.
Great.